One of the most important speeches that Abraham Lincoln ever delivered in his whole career was the House Divided speech, which he delivered to the Republican State Convention in Springfield, Illinois in 1858. He was speaking in the old state capitol building, the State House of Representatives in Illinois, and he was addressing Republican delegates from across the state. It was unique. He was their first endorsement for a U.S. Senate candidate. You have to remember something as context before we actually read the text of this document. Back then, people did not vote for U.S. senators directly. The state legislatures did. But in 1858, the Illinois Republicans were breaking all the ground rules because they wanted to make clear to the country and to the state that Abraham Lincoln was going to be their first and only candidate for the U.S. Senate to take on the incumbent, a Democrat named Stephen Douglas, and to make sure that everybody wasn't confused that Douglas would be their candidate. Lincoln is actually going to address this in the course of his speech, and it's the most critical background you need to appreciate what's going on here. Lincoln begins by addressing the president and gentlemen of the convention, and he says, "If we could first know where we are and whither we are tending, we could then better judge what to do and how to do it." And then he says, "We are now into the 5th year since a policy was initiated with the avowed object and confident promise of putting an end to slavery agitation." So he's giving background, which is clear, but the background requires some background of its own. If you don't know what the reference is to this 5th year, you might not realize that he's speaking about the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the repeal of the Missouri Compromise that had been introduced by the incumbent Democratic senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas, the little giant. This bill, which had offered a popular sovereignty, allowing the voters of the Western territories in Kansas and Nebraska to decide for themselves whether or not to have slavery, that was controversial. It had realigned the political parties and had created an explosion. Lincoln says, under the operation of that policy, that agitation has not only not ceased, but has constantly augmented. Whatever Douglas had promised when he introduced this policy, it had now been completely overridden by events. In my opinion, Lincoln says, it will not cease until a crisis shall have been reached. And then he quotes from the Bible, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." A house divided against itself cannot stand. He had used this comment from before, from Mark's Gospel, and he was using it now. It was a reference that Americans understood well from the New Testament in this era, and Lincoln applies it to the question of slavery. "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free." Cannot endure half slave and half free. He says, "I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." This is the dramatic tension in the speech. It will become all one thing or all the other. Either the opponents of slavery, he says, will arrest the further spread of it and place it where the public mind shall rest in the belief that it is in the course of ultimate extinction. Now, this is the underlying and fundamental premise of everything Lincoln will say from this point, 1858, forward until the actual coming of the Civil War. He believes in stopping the spread of slavery because it will lead to the ultimate extinction of the institution. Not by force, not by coercion, but by the voluntary actions of Southerners themselves. Or its advocates, he says, will push it forward till it shall become lawful alike in all states, old as well as new, north as well as south. Lincoln claims this business about the territories is not just about the territories, but about the very future of the country in states like Illinois, where they were standing right then. Later in the speech, he says, "We shall lie down pleasantly dreaming that the people of Missouri are on the verge of making their state free, and we shall awake to the reality instead that the Supreme Court has made Illinois a slave state." Now here he's referring to another nemesis, Roger Taney and the Taney Court, which had ruled the year before in 1857 that Congress could not prohibit slavery in the territories, and now was considering perhaps future cases that were working their way through the federal courts that might allow Southern slave masters to bring their slaves into northern free states and perhaps keep them there for indefinite periods of time. This was a threat that Lincoln was evoking here. To meet and overthrow the power of that dynasty is the work now before all those who would prevent that consummation. This is what we have to do, he says. but how can we best do it? And now here's where he addresses the questions about whether Stephen Douglas was actually a Republican. He says, there are those who denounce us openly to their own friends and yet whisper us softly that Senator Douglas is the aptest or best instrument that there is with which to effect that object. They do not tell us, nor has he told us, that he wishes any such object to be effected. They wish us to infer all from the facts that he now has a little quarrel with the present head of the dynasty, and that he has regularly voted with us on a single point upon which he and we have never differed. This is the reference to the feud that has erupted between Senator Douglas and President James Buchanan over whether or not what's been happening, in particular in the Kansas territory, represents a culmination of Douglas's popular sovereignty principle in the territories or a repudiation of it because of fraud and corruption. Douglas had said in 1854 that the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the repeal of the Missouri Compromise would let people in the territories decide for themselves whether or not to have slavery. But in the years since then, both sides, pro-slavery and anti-slavery, had rushed settlers into the territory to try to settle the fate of its position on slavery. The result was what they called Bleeding Kansas. It involved corruption, and it forced Stephen Douglas to repudiate what was happening in defiance of President Buchanan's directives. Buchanan said the results of the corrupt constitutional meetings in the Kansas territory were that the state wanted, or that the territory wanted to enter the Union as a slave state. Douglas said popular sovereignty had not been fairly wrought in the territorial debates and meetings and votes, and he stood against the president, in effect with the Republicans, and that's what Lincoln is referring to here. And that's why some in the Republican Party were arguing that Stephen Douglas should be the Republican candidate for Senate, that he should be the Republican candidate perhaps for president. And that's why Illinois Republicans who were skeptical of Douglas, like Lincoln, were now rallying around Lincoln and nominating him to be their first and only candidate for U.S. Senate, breaking all the rules in an era when something like this had never happened before. Lincoln said, "They remind us that Douglas, he, is a very great man, and that the largest of us are very small ones. Let this be granted, but a living dog," Lincoln says, "is better than a dead lion. Judge Douglas, if not a dead lion for this work, is at least a caged and toothless one. How can he oppose the advances of slavery? He don't care anything about it." He's now referring to speeches that Douglas has made earlier. "His avowed mission is impressing the public heart to care nothing about the spread of slavery." Douglas kept telling people, let them decide what happens in their own territories. We don't need to care. Now, as ever, Lincoln says, "I wish to not misrepresent Judge Douglas's position, question his motives, or do aught that could be personally offensive to him. But he says, he clearly is not now with us. He does not pretend to be, and he does not promise to ever be." Lincoln refers to the history of the Republican Party. 2 years ago, the Republicans of the nation mustered over 1,300,000 strong during the election of 1856. "We did this under the single impulse of resistance to a common danger, with every external circumstance against us." And then Lincoln says, "Of strange, discordant, and even hostile elements we gathered from the four winds, and formed and fought the battle through under the constant hot fire of a disciplined, proud, and pampered enemy." He's now speaking to an audience of Republican Party delegates, the men who were part of this effort, and he knows he's appealing to their sense of shared sacrifice. "Did we brave all then to falter now? Now," Lincoln says, "when that same enemy is wavering, dissevered, and belligerent? The result is not doubtful," he says. "We shall not fail. If we stand firm, we shall not fail. Wise counsels may accelerate or mistakes delay, but sooner or later, the victory is sure to come." Lincoln was offering a vision of a future of a nation that would ultimately see slavery extinguished. This was his call to the Republican Party and to the wider country from 1858 forward, from his House Divided moment on June 16th until he became the great emancipator during the Civil War.